Hello, and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today, we're going to be chatting about one of the highest requested movies here on Based on a True Story, the 2011 movie Moneyball. And joining us to help separate fact from fiction is attorney Will Cooper, who worked in the Oakland Athletics Clubhouse during the timeline of the movie in the A's 2002 season. Before we bring Will on the line, let's set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. If you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm about to say 3 things. 2 of them are true, and that means 1 of them is a lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1. Jonah Hill's character in the movie was based on someone whose name was not Peter Brand. Number 2. Art Howe was not the angry person we see in the movie. Number 3. It is true that the Oakland A's made their players pay for soda during the 2002 season. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to find the 2 facts scattered somewhere throughout the episode, and then by a simple process of elimination, you'll know which one is a lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right. Now it's time to bring Will Cooper on the line to chat about the historical accuracy of Moneyball. We'll dig into some of the details of the movie in a moment, but before we do that, if we take a step back and kind of look at the movie overall, how well do you think it did capturing the essence of that 2002 season for the Oakland Athletics?
I think at a very high level, it did a good job of capturing what was going on. The overall arc of the story, I think, was right and accurate. Certainly, there are a lot of objective facts in the movie about the 20-game win streak and records of the A's and the payroll compared to other teams, things of that nature, that were all accurate and were sort of the core of the movie. As you drill down lower and get more granular in the analysis, it becomes kind of a mix of accurate and inaccurate. But at a very high level, I do think it did a good job of capturing the essence of the season in most respects.
A movie made about something that you were there for. What were your first thoughts as you were watching?
It was really cool. I've watched, like most of us, hundreds, if not thousands of movies in my life. And this is the first time there's ever been a movie made, and very well may be the last movie ever made, where I was on the ground floor for a fair amount of what happened, and experienced firsthand and knew many of the folks in the movie. So it was really cool. I mean, I'm sure it was much more surreal for the people in the movie that they were actually characters in the show, as opposed to me, where I was just an observer. But the book itself, when that first came out, of course, before the movie, was really exciting to read. And then to see the movie a few years later was just a lot of fun, and certainly stands out as a unique movie for me, given that the underlying facts I was familiar with.
We were talking a little bit before we hit record here, but can you clarify what your role was with the A's during the season?
Absolutely. So I had 2 roles with the A's. One, I was on the clubhouse staff. I was in the visiting clubhouse. So I did a lot of work for the A's directly, but then I would also, on game day, I'd be in the visiting clubhouse, where the teams that would come to the Coliseum and play the A's, we would take care of them, the clubhouse staff. So pregame meals and laundry and running errands and all of the activities in the clubhouse. I was part of the team that helped on that side of things, on the visiting side. And then I would do a lot of activities for the A's as well. It's one group, the home side and the visiting side. It's all one team, but my focus on game day would be the visiting side. And then I was on the video editing team. So it was part of the scouting department, where I would take a bunch of film, edit it in all sorts of different ways so that players, coaches, front office could all review and analyze the film. And that was one of the main ways that I got to know the folks that were in the movie, because in the movie, as you see, the video room is consistently a part of the movie, and that was accurate. Billy and his team would be in the video room watching the game, watching film quite frequently. And so I wasn't, obviously my character wasn't in the movie, but I was in that room and got a lot of exposure by being there.
You alluded to something I wanted to ask about, because in the very beginning of the movie, it actually opens October 15, 2001. And we see some footage of the A's, Johnny Damon, hitting against Roger Clemens of the New York Yankees. This is the elimination game of the AL Division Series. And then the movie shows something you mentioned, the payrolls of the two teams, like over $114 million for the Yankees, and the A's payroll is below $40 million. And the Yankees win the game. So they go into the offseason, try to figure out how they're going to compete against these big payrolls. Can you give a little more context around what things were like for the A's at the end of the 2001 season going in the offseason?
Absolutely. So obviously a huge disappointment. Nothing unique to the A's. Anytime you have a really good team and you gear up for the postseason and lose, it's disappointing, especially when you lose in a close series. And then we lost some of our big key players, Giambi being, of course, the main one. So there was curiosity at the time. Okay, how are we going to replace Giambi? What are we going to do about that? One thing that was big at the time that wasn't a part of the theme of the movie, was that we had a really, really good team and a really deep team, notwithstanding losing Giambi and Damon and Isringhausen. So our three young starting pitchers, Hudson, Mulder, Zito, all of whom were drafted by the A's and brought up through the A's organization. They were three of the best pitchers in baseball, and to have three of them like that was incredibly valuable. So nobody was expecting the A's to tank and win 60 games. But there certainly was some concern about what we were going to do to what the A's were going to do to make up for the fact that they were losing primarily Giambi he was really the face of the team at that point and a real leader. One of the reasons I use the word curiosity is because it wasn't until Moneyball, the book, came out, which was of course about this season. So a year or two later, that all the sabermetrics that the A's were using to create their team and all of the things that the book and the movie talk about, that wasn't really out there and recognized until the book came out. And then it really caught on. Now, certainly people that were very knowledgeable about baseball knew what was going on, and people that were following the A's closely, and Bill James was a known figure in the sport. But at the time of the book and the movie, the sabermetrics stuff was a lot less prominent than after the book came out. And that's when the revolution sort of became more and more public.
Okay. Well, that kind of process starts to get introduced in the movie. It shows Billy Beane is negotiating a trade in Cleveland, and he notices that the deal is disrupted when one of the guys, he kind of whispers something to somebody else. And later on, Billy tracks him down, find out his name is Peter Brand. He's an analyst, all about the numbers. And before long, Billy ends up hiring Peter to work for him in Oakland. How well does the movie do showing how Billy Beane met this character, Peter Brand?
So I don't know. I don't have firsthand knowledge of exactly how Billy identified Paul and what their one-on-one conversations were like at that time. But one lesson I learned generally about movies is you have to Hollywood it up. You have to have a story and drama. And real life is sometimes a lot more boring and sort of slow moving than even really fascinating areas of life like baseball and front offices. I think it's really unlikely that the meeting in Cleveland where Peter Brand, who in the movies Peter Brand, but his character is Paul DiPodesto, in real life Billy's assistant. I don't think Paul whispered in someone's ear and Billy saw it and then walked to his cube. That was great theater. But what was going on at the time was the people Billy and a number of other people in baseball, people actually running the teams, were aware of the sabermetrics revolution that was going on. Again, Bill James had been doing it for years. it was growing. It was still a minority of teams that were thinking that way. But the people really at the heart of baseball understood what was going on. And so it wasn't like Paul had some secret that Billy had never heard of. And Billy said, wow, you have some secret, come to the A's. I think what the most likely scenario was Billy was well aware of sabermetrics, and he identified Paul as somebody with very high IQ, very strong analytical thinker, well versed in sabermetrics, and had been in the game for a few years already, and said, why don't you come to Oakland so we can implement this philosophy? So still a cool story to me, but not quite the drama of that scene in Cleveland. I think that's unlikely to have been how it went.
It's a movie. They do have to make it fun to watch, and sometimes meetings aren't always fun to watch.
Exactly. Yeah, and that takes me back to when I first heard the movie was coming. I was like, wow, how are they going to make a movie out of this? I mean, because it really is guys sitting around in chairs, on the phone and watching games. And I thought I really liked the movie, setting aside the extent to which it was accurate or not. I really liked it. And I think the people that wrote the movie and produced it did a good job of using drama to kind of fill in the blanks in what otherwise would have been somewhat of a boring narrative. And that's a good example.
It's meetings about numbers.
Yeah.
Like that sounds like a real fascinating thing to watch.
Yeah, I know. And they did. The people that made the movie are very talented because it was a really good movie, and using that raw material to create a really good movie takes a lot of talent.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the numbers, the way that the movie shows or kind of explains this is that baseball has historically used a lot of different factors to find their players. And a lot of them are overlooked for a variety of reasons. Scouts think that, different players have flaws and things. But then it mentions Bill James that you had talked about, saying that he kind of cut through all of those intangible things to focus on the numbers, using math to build out the team. And according to the movie, it mentions basically boiling all the numbers down, all the stats that they track, boiling it all down to a single number. The on-base percentage is what the movie mentions. Did the movie do a good job explaining sabermetrics and the method of using mathematics to analyze the players?
I think the movie did an incredibly good job of taking sabermetrics and making it into something that a movie could focus on, which again was a huge task, and they did it. They pulled it off. In terms of actually being accurate, I don't think that it was. Sabermetrics and I'm not steeped in sabermetrics myself, but I know enough to know that it's a real science. Very, very intelligent people from PhDs from Berkeley and MIT dedicate their entire professional lives to crunching these numbers and building out spreadsheets. And so it's a real science, really complicated, deep science. And on-base percentage definitely is an example, one example among others, of a stat that Bill James and the sabermetrics community identified as being underappreciated. And it makes sense when you think about it, right? If you get a base hit and a line drive to center and you go to first base, that's exciting. But if you get a walk, you're still on first base. It's the same thing. And oftentimes that hit was on the first pitch, whereas a walk took 6 pitches. And the attrition with the pitcher, in the aggregate, as all of your players get their at-bats, the additional pitches can really matter. So having a good eye and getting a walk and having a high on-base percentage is really important. And it is definitely something that the old school crowd didn't appreciate. They actually thought batting average, because that's showing your skill, that's showing that you can take the bat and hit the ball with it, was more important. So no, it's not the case that all sabermetrics boils down to on base. I think there's a lot of different factors that go in, a lot of different stats that are looked at. And I think the true experts look at the totality of any player in context and look at all of the various stats, giving appropriate weight to each category. But on base was one of the main ones, and one of the more prominent ones early, where it was really easy to explain why this is important and why it was often overlooked.
You talked about something that certainly shows up in the movie, and that is that some of the older scouts, the more traditional scouts, they don't like this idea of just looking at the on-base percentages, as the movie points out. This guy has problems off the field. This guy is too old. He can't. This guy can't play defense. I think there's even a scene in there where Billy's like, I don't care if he can play in the field. I don't care what position he plays. He can get on base. That's all that matters. So the impression I got was that there was a lot of pushback to this idea of sabermetrics and using math to drive which players to sign. Is that true?
Yes. And the movie dramatizes it a fair amount, particularly I think with Art Howe and Grady Fusion, where there's like very overt excessive tension between them and Billy. And I don't think it was, from everything I saw and all the inferences I could draw from the people involved, I don't think it was like that. The movie made a caricature of it, but there was undoubtedly real tension, intellectual tension, at all times. And I think sometimes it would become interpersonal tension, but intellectually, yes, the scouts were overwhelmingly wedded to old school style of analysis, where you watch baseball, you watch hundreds of games a year, you've been doing it your whole life, you can spot talent. Every scout that's been doing it for a while does have some successes, and they weigh those successes very heavily in their own self analysis, and that was a really core feature of the culture of baseball. And that's what really makes this a story, is that, and by a story, I mean that the story of Moneyball, the book and the movie and the revolution, and I think it's a fair word to use the word revolution, is that baseball really was filled with, it was sort of this insulated universe, not subject to typical market forces. If a team's not doing very well, it's not going bankrupt, it's still going to be there. So it was this insular world, this sort of club of old school thinking. And what Billy and the A's did, and some others too, but I think Billy and the A's deserve to be considered the leaders here, is take science and rationality and objectivity and just bring it into that universe in a very forceful way. And that did create tension.
Okay, yeah. You mentioned Grady Fusion, and in the movie, the impression that I got kind of walking away from it was this concept of it's Billy and Pete Brand in the movie, at least. It's those two against everybody else, and no matter what, Billy's all in. We're doing this. It's you and me against the world kind of atmosphere. Was that the atmosphere that was going on in the front office there?
My sense is it was a lot more collegial than the movie would portray. I think there was tension, and I think the tension boiled over at times. But in general, if the movie really portrays, for example, Billy and Art Howe as being just, really disliking each other. Billy will walk in the room and Art will, look down in anger, and Art will refuse to do the things Billy says. And these guys were all professional, good people. So I don't think it was, I'm obviously not privy to all of the things that went on behind closed doors between people, but I don't think it was like that. But I think there was tension. I do think Billy and Paul and their team, I think they understood this new way of thinking. They'd fully internalized it. They recognized that it was the right way to think about it, that it did give a real advantage to the A's. And in some ways, a lot of it was driven by the A's salary cap restrictions, right? There could be a player that the A's thought, Billy and his team thought was the best player in the league from a sabermetric standpoint. And that same person might happen to be 6'5", 230 and hit 45 home runs a year. So, and they would love to have been able to have that person. They just couldn't afford them. So a lot of it was driven by the payroll. But my sense was, yes, there was tension, and it took time for other people in the organization to actually internalize and understand this philosophy. And so if you're Grady Fusion or Art Howe, you've been in baseball for 35 years already, and you're successful, and you're a manager, and you're the head of scouting, and you've got World Series rings on your fingers, you're going to have strong views about how to go about things, and your strong views will have decades of reinforcement, right? That they're correct. And then these new people, one of whom's 24-year-old who never played pro baseball, and Paul, are saying, you know what, you're wrong. This is the better way. There's going to be tension, and it just takes time for people to understand how this process works. And some old school baseball players, I don't think will ever get there. Now, fast forward now 20 years later, and I think it's ubiquitous throughout baseball that sabermetrics is a key consideration. I think probably every team has sabermetricians in the front office. And I don't know, but I would guess a strong majority have a solid core team of people doing sabermetrics, and it's a guiding part of their philosophy. So it happened, but it took time. And at the really early stages, even within the A's organization, you were going to have lots of people who just didn't understand what was going on.
That makes perfect sense. And the character that you mentioned there, Art Howe, the way that the movie portrays it shows that after Art, refuses to play Scott Hatterberg when he signs him, refuses to play him and instead plays Carlos Pena, then Billy Beane ends up trading Carlos so that the manager can't play him. So, I could certainly see how that they could be using that tension as a plot point in the movie in order to get that there. But as far as reality, we know, of course, from history, if you're a baseball fan, then Carlos Pena did play for the A's, and he did get traded. But how much of what, I guess, the sabermetric aspect of that between Carlos Pena and Scott Hatterberg, do you know how much of that played into what really happened versus what we saw in the movie?
Yeah, I think even in the movie, you see that a lot of this is conversations between Billy and Art Howe, one-on-one. So I don't want to suggest that I have a great window into how this played out. But what I think my sense is, first of all, and this is important for context, probably the biggest distortion in the movie, in my view, among others that are close in terms of being big distortion, Art Howe was a really friendly, positive, nice person. His demeanor was cheerful and optimistic. I didn't know him incredibly well, so he may have had a dark side that I wasn't aware of, but I doubt it. And the movie portrays him as this just really surly, angry person. And the movie also portrays him as somebody who tells Billy what to do. I'm not going to start Hatterberg. I'm going to start Pena. Billy's the boss, right? Billy was the boss. I doubt there was that level of insubordination. From what I saw, it was not that way at all. I think so. I think the movie dramatized that some. But what the movie did was take this underlying tension between people that believed in sabermetrics and those who didn't. In one way, that was within the Oakland A's organization, but it was also broader. It was between different teams. There were different teams with different philosophies, and there was arguments between the A's and other teams about whose approach was better. There was a lot of tension throughout baseball. What Moneyball did was take the tension that was in Oakland and dramatize it in fairly elaborate and creative ways to make a movie out of it. I would be very surprised if it was actually true that Art Howe refused to do what Billy wanted. And as a result, Billy had to trade a player in order to get his guy to start. That strikes me as very unlikely. More likely, there was just general differences in how people were looking at on base percentage, how people were looking at, how important defense was, walks versus average. And the movie was just dramatizing that.
A little bit of a comedic aspect that as I was watching the movie, you don't really see this in the public, but in that trade with Pena, Billy works in that the Detroit Tigers are going to stock the A's soda machine for 3 years. Is that something that ever gets thrown into trades, things like that?
As a member of the clubhouse staff, I can speak definitively about soda and tell you that that is not true. The A's did not charge for soda.
I see David Justice putting the
that was pure. That was not even a dramatization of a nugget of reality. That was full-fledged Hollywood. The A's payroll was very low, but every player was allowed to drink as many Cokes as they wanted for free. I can attest to that with firsthand knowledge.
Okay. Yeah, I thought that was funny that they kind of threw that into. I'm sure to just exaggerate that payroll difference. And
yeah,
in the movie, at the beginning of the 2002 season, things start off really rough, and it only exacerbates this tension that's going on. There's a scene I think we hear on the radio. There's some talk show that's kind of explaining that what they're doing is, it's called Moneyball, and it's based on a book by Bill James, and they're kind of explaining some of this, but then it says that the A's lost 14 out of 17 games in the early part of the season. So apparently this isn't really working. How well did the movie do showing how the 2002 season began?
Well, certainly did a good job of showing that the A's got off to a slow start and there were some challenges. From my perspective, though, going back to what I mentioned earlier on, I think the prominence of Moneyball in sabermetrics really arose after the book. And so the public conversation was less focused on Moneyball during the time the book was being written and the time the events of the book were taking place than after. So that wasn't a huge part of the conversation at the time. Now, of course, it makes sense that the movie would suggest that it was, to have sort of a coherent narrative about what was going on. But it was really later on, and it was probably with a year or 2 years after Moneyball was written and published that debate reached its sort of zenith in terms of hearing about it and the emotion that particularly the critics of Moneyball philosophy were expressing their views. So the movie did a good job of portraying the slow start, but to me, the emphasis was a little bit inaccurate.
Okay. And then after the start, kind of they made a point at that All-Star break, in July, the first half of the season, their goal was to be within 7 games of first place. Was that kind of what the target was for the first half of the season?
I could see that. I mean, my guess would be that the thinking and Paul was and is very good with numbers and very analytical, and so my guess is that he would have said something along the lines of, as long as we're within 7 games of first place, we still have a strong probability of making the playoffs, something like that, as opposed to we want to be within 7 games. I'm sure, the A's would want to be ahead in first place if they were going to choose their goal, and they were certainly capable of achieving that. And I think they knew that they were capable of achieving that before the season started. So that would be my guess. I doubt that was posted on the wall as the goal.
And in the movie, it shows Billy Beane going around. There's a montage of a Brad Pitt version of Billy going around and motivating the players to get them on board and have patience at the plate, get on base. If we get on base, we win. And it seems to work. The A's start winning and even win 20 games in a row, setting the American League record. How well did the movie do showing this turnaround in the season?
Well, the turnaround was great. And certainly, I think the movie captured the enthusiasm in a nice way. The trade of Jeremy Giambi at the time was a really pivotal moment. And it was a surprise because Jeremy Giambi's numbers were really good. And he did fit the A's mold, high on base, not as good on the defensive side of the ball, which at the time, was part of the A's model. So that was a surprise. And then Mabry came in, and it really did change the trajectory of the season. Now, a lot of that could have been coincidental, the timing. And then the A's really took off. Now, in my opinion, and I think the Moneyball, the folks that the sabermetricians and the people that believe in Moneyball, my senses would agree with me. A lot of what was happening that season was less the A's changing, was less people being motivated in a new way, and was more about a sample size just growing and reaching a higher number such that the accurate sort of inherent potential of the team was showing. Over a small sample size, you can have a poor record but be a really good team. And then as your sample size grows, typically the inherent sort of intrinsic performance you would expect starts to reveal itself. And to me, a lot of what was happening was reversion to the mean and just the A's performance taking shape in the way that that a larger sample size, was bringing out. Now, the movie showed scenes of Billy going around motivating people and talking about taking pitches and, drawing walks. I don't know if there was a lot of that going on, but what I do know is the A's philosophy, and Billy and his team, David Forrest and Dan Feinstein, the folks that are currently running the organization, and all the folks that have been at the A's the last 30 years even, deserve a ton of credit for having a philosophy that permeates not just the big leagues, but the minor leagues as well. So when players enter the A's system, they are taught, these philosophies about patience at the plate. Now, a lot of the players that come into the system already have an orientation in that direction. That's why the A's pick them. But emphasizing the right things, including patience at the plate, it's not something where Billy just walked in the middle of the season and started talking about it and then everybody started doing it. It's something that the foundation was being laid for many years. And the A's should really, to me, should get a lot of credit for that player development side of the equation. They're not just plucking out people with statistics from other teams that other people aren't recognizing and making trades. They are doing that. But another big thing they're doing is just having an organizational philosophy that emphasizes the right things.
Yeah, as I was watching that and watching Billy go around and motivating everybody himself, I'm not saying that he doesn't motivate people, but it's like there's not really any coaches doing any of this, or I would expect that it'd be more of a team effort.
Yeah, there's a lot more interaction between Art Howe and his staff and the players in that way than with Billy.
During that winning streak, what was the atmosphere like in the clubhouse?
It was absolutely phenomenal. I mean, hard to think of more enjoyable place to be than a big league clubhouse when your team is white hot. I mean, it was awesome for everybody, even the folks like me who were, filling up soda cans with Pepsi as opposed to hitting the baseball. I mean, it was just a lot of fun. And the movie dramatizes it some, but the A's did have a boisterous clubhouse. The A's did play loud music, sometimes probably when they shouldn't have. The A's did a bunch of young millionaires, running around. So there was partying going on, and there was an atmosphere, again, dramatized in the movie, but not coming out of nowhere. So during the win streak, not only there was just a lot of euphoria from how the team was performing, but a team that already had a personality that was, happy and not having to be prodded into partying.
I know there's a lot of superstition in baseball. I know during the streak, I'm sure nobody would ever talk about the record. Is that something that it has to be on people's mind as you start to get close? I mean, it has to be something that gets talked about.
Yeah, it's one of the fun things about baseball is, the superstitions are real. People take them seriously. You don't talk to the pitcher about the no-hitter in the eighth inning. So yeah, it was a part of it. And one of the things that the movie doesn't touch on much, and obviously this is not the fault of a movie. A movie is only going to be able to capture so much, and the narrative is only going to be a sliver of what actually happened. But the Angels were really good that year. And they were winning a ton too. And they won the World Series not long after. And a lot of the 20-game win streak was, okay, we won. The Angels won again. How do we get a more comfortable lead from these guys? Because they're a really good team. So that was a big part of the ultimate reality. It didn't need to be in the movie. It didn't really fit the narrative. But on the ground at the time, that was a big part of what was happening.
Some of the superstition that the movie shows with Billy is he doesn't like to be at the stadium when there's a game. During this streak, the movie shows he's driving, he's listening to it on the radio, and the A's are up like 11-0 early. So he's like, you get the impression he's like, okay, it's safe, go to the stadium. And just as he does, they're playing the Royals. They start mounting their comeback, and they end up tying the game. And it's only on like this pinch hit home run from Scott Hatterberg that the A's end up winning the game, and that gives them the AL record for the 20th win. How well did the movie do showing that last game in the winning streak?
I don't know the specifics of what Billy did during that game, but the movie did a pretty good job of making it entertaining to follow somebody's game watching habits, which is a testament to the movie producers that they were able to make drama out of that. Which the truth is, at least back then, Billy did have. It was true, and this is all public. That Billy didn't sit there and watch the games every time, and would sometimes be driving or watching something else or in the weight room, and not sitting there watching the game, which you would kind of assume the GM would do. But that is true that he did not sit and watch the game, and he's been open about that, and it is in fact true, and it's a quirk of I think it says a couple things. One thing it says is that he really really cares about the A's and who wins and who loses, and it's just easier for him to not sit there and have to watch it because he's so committed to the team and their success. And then it also, to me at least, it's sort of harmonious with the philosophy that a lot of the things you see with your eye and think are important in baseball, that watching, the sweet swing or the confident stride of the player, whatever, are actually irrelevant. And if you have, and even misleading, to the extent they're relevant, they mislead the people's perception. And as long as you have a command of the right data and right facts, you've got what you need. And I'm oversimplifying it, but I just think it's it's a nice way to think about that as that sort of interaction between Billy's game watching and the overall philosophy of the A's.
I'm assuming then that he was that way. That was kind of his game watching habit even prior to this season. Because part of the impression that I got from the movie was because he's trying this new thing, it's just so nerve wracking to watch.
No, I think it was his approach generally, and that touches on the movie in a way that makes tons of sense for a movie. Portrays it much more as we're trying this big new thing, and it's a totally different situation, and we're going to see how this big new thing plays out. There was a lot more continuity over a number of years. Billy was reading Bill James before he was GM, when Sandy Alderson was the GM. He was getting more and more familiar with sabermetrics. Paul came on board. The train was already moving to some extent. I think Paul accelerated it and brought a lot of firepower to it. And it's also the case that while, again, Giambi, Damon, and Isringhausen left, there was a lot of continuity on the roster as well. So it wasn't like the season before was one universe and then this season was some transformative new thing. This was, again, the A's doubling down on what they were already doing with this philosophy.
Okay, that makes sense. And the movies do that a lot. They change the timeline around and, okay, that makes sense to have it all happen in a season.
Exactly. What I just described is not a movie. They had to do it, but that my sense is that it was a lot. This was much more of a snapshot of something that was ongoing than a huge change.
Towards the end of the movie, if we do talk about the 2002 season that it's focusing on, there's not a lot of time between the 20-game winning streak, and then we see the A's playing the ALDS elimination game against the Twins, and the Twins end up beating the A's, so their season's over. The hope at a championship is gone. Can you feel a little more context around how the 2002 season came to an end for the A's?
Yeah, I mean, the movie did a good job actually capturing, and it was kind of abrupt in that way, but that was reality. I mean, we had this incredible season. You know, I've been a diehard A's fan my whole life. It's painful still to talk about it. It always will be, but to have such a cool situation where you're the underdog, you know, you're David, you're slaying Goliath, you know, for 162 games, to be setting records and leading the league in wins. And then to have it, you know, then you march into the postseason and 4 games later, your season's over. It's very, very painful, and much more painful, of course, for the people that were directly involved in building the team and the players. But, you know, as a fan and a part of the organization, very painful. And the movie captured it. And it goes to, the movie doesn't get into this much because this is not a movie subject matter for a movie. It's not something that resonates with people while they're, you know, eating popcorn and drinking, you know, gallons of Coke. But the sample size point that I made a little while ago about over time, but with a bigger sample size, your intrinsic performance is, you know, comes true. But over smaller sample sizes, anything can happen. The A's, the first half of that season, were not as bad, or the first third of the season were nowhere near as bad as their record suggested. Of course, during the 20-game win streak, they weren't that good. So even in 20, 30, 40, 50 game sample sizes, you don't get an accurate reflection. By the time you get to 162 games, there's a lot of signal and a lot less noise. But then you start over again, and all of a sudden, it's a 5-game series, right? And again, anything can happen. And it's a nice point that here we are talking in 2021 about this phenomenon. And look who just won the World Series, the Atlanta Braves. Atlanta Braves won 88 games. The A's won 86 this year. If their best pitcher, Chris Bassett, didn't get hurt, the A's win 2 more games. They have the same number of wins as the World Series champion. The Giants and the Dodgers both won 107 games. Neither one of them even had gotten to the World Series, let alone win it. The team that won it won 20 fewer games. And so it just shows how the playoffs really is a crapshoot, because you get nowhere near the sample size you need to have your intrinsic performance actually be reflected in the result, your intrinsic strength reflected in the results. And it sounds like an excuse to an awful lot of people, and maybe I'm drinking the Kool-Aid as an A's fan, but I really believe it. And while the movie, of course, isn't going to talk, you know, you're not going to, sample sizes is not riveting, but it did, I think, it did do a good job of capturing the disappointment of losing quickly in such a short series.
And I could see how that would be something that would almost speak against using sabermetrics if you need this bigger sample size. But yeah, when it comes to the playoffs, how many years in the playoffs are you going to have? And your teams are going to all be different before you can start to build up the sample size, because there's not that many games.
It wouldn't weigh against using sabermetrics, because you can't change the fact that the playoffs are a small sample size. So 2 points. Number one, you need to get in the playoffs. You need to get in over the 162 games. So you should always maximize the probability you're going to get in. And sabermetrics helps all teams do that, irrespective of their payroll. Sabermetrics is just another way of saying being smarter about baseball and more scientific. That's all it is using additional tools to analyze your team and build your team. And then once you're in the playoffs, you wouldn't discard sabermetrics as a tool. You would still want your team to be the best it could be. You just need to recognize there's 8 other teams in the playoffs. So your best probability is going to be below 20%, no matter who you are. But if you have a good team rooted in sabermetrics, maybe your probability of winning is 19% instead of 18. So you still want to maximize your probability. You just have to recognize that because of the sample size, it's going to be difficult to the odds are going to be stacked against you, no matter who you are. Just like the Dodgers and the Giants this year, two historic teams, top 20 all times in wins, both of them, and they were quick to get out of the playoffs. And then the champion, 88 games, and they were missing their best player.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, they put on a good series, though. They did put on a good series.
They did, and I'm not taking anything away from the Braves. They deserve it, but it's just a really powerful example of what the movie showed in a movie way by where the A's lost to the Twins. Just how a quick series can be real devastating and not feel like the result it should be if you're on the losing end.
Well, at the very end of the movie, it kind of goes back to something I mentioned at the very beginning, the payroll. And it mentions that the A's in 2002 had the same number of wins as the Yankees, but the Yankees paid $1.4 million per win on their payroll, whereas the A's paid $260,000 per win. And then we see at the very end, we see Billy Beane touring Fenway Park with the Red Sox owner, John Henry. And we find out that the Red Sox have hired Bill James, and they make an offer to Billy to become the highest paid GM in the history of sports. But ultimately, he decides to turn that offer down and stay in Oakland, something that the movie very heavily implies has something to do with his family. And then I think there's some text at the very end that mentions using that philosophy, the Red Sox won their first World Series since 1918, a couple years later. So how well did this movie do showing kind of the aftermath of that season and how things kind of all wrapped up?
So the movie did, I think, a pretty good job of showing what happened at the end. It is the case that Billy got an offer from the Red Sox and went to Boston. It was a very, very strong offer. I think it would have made him the highest paid GM of all time. The Red Sox were one of I mentioned earlier how there was a growing pocket within baseball of people recognizing sabermetrics as a really valuable tool for analyzing players and building your team. And the Red Sox were very much a part of that pocket and recognized the value and recognized Billy's success in implementing the philosophy on the field. And then it's, I absolutely believe that, Theo Epstein came when Billy didn't take the job, and then Theo Epstein came. I do strongly believe they were implementing the A's philosophies, the philosophies the A's were using, crunching lots of numbers, and they were able to unlike what happened in Oakland, they were able to put a lot of money behind that. And, the results were incredible for Boston. Now, the simple narrative is, well, they had a bunch of money, they implemented the philosophy, and then they won World Series. But the more nuanced and I think more accurate way to think about it touches back on the playoffs, the sample size in the playoffs. The Red Sox used the philosophy to get in the playoffs, but the A's had already done that. The A's had already established they could do that year in and year out. The cookie crumbled the Red Sox way in the postseason under Epstein a few times, and it crumbled the other way for the A's. Now I'm a bitter A's fan, so maybe I'm rationalizing, but I do believe that that's what happened, and I think that the A's teams that were winning 105 games were just as good as the Red Sox teams. That being said, the movie was right that Boston recognized what Billy was doing, wanted him to come, and then implemented that philosophy to great success in the subsequent years.
Okay, yeah, and it always helps to have a bigger budget behind it. That's usually
it does. There's no question about it. Yep, and a lot of players that are very strong sabermetrically are also traditionally very strong. Right, Albert Pujols. 6'5", 240, 45 home runs a year, 145 RBIs. He also happens to walk a ton, So you get the same player can be really, really highly regarded in both schools of thought. And in that instance, the money will flow to that player. So a lot of guys the A's really liked for different reasons than other teams might like them to some extent. This is back now, just about it's much more the case now that people are all looking at the same sheet of music and singing the same song. So you don't see that as much now, but back in the day, there were a lot of examples of that. So the Red Sox would be able to, they were really smart, and they'd get sort of Kevin Youkilis and the guys who traditionalists might not have recognized. And then they would also be able to go out and pay for Manny Ramirez, who everybody, no matter what your school of thought was, recognized was incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I think they even mentioned Youkilis because his batting stance. Some of the older scouts, the kind of the more traditional scouts, were not a fan of him for that reason, and that they use that as an example in the movie. I think
it's great when there's warts, right, on the player. It creates an opportunity for people to discount that player in a way where if you recognize the wart doesn't actually matter, or if it does matter, it matters a lot less than people do, creates a ton of opportunity. And yeah, Kevin Youkilis, a great example of that, just like Matt Stairs was, and Chad Bradford and Scott Hatterberg.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who was there for a lot of the events that we saw in the movie, what's something that somebody who watched the movie that you wish they knew that didn't make it into the movie for whatever reason?
I think if there was something that I would want people that only know about the A's through Moneyball to recognize, if the only thing you know about the A's is the movie, I don't think you appreciate like how this was something that this revolution in baseball, where objectivity, rationality slowly gained more and more market share and eventually took over, was something that lasted decades. And it started many years before the movie, and it continued on many years after the movie. And I think now it's common. If you're watching a game on ESPN, you see on-base percentage right there. You see, OPS, on-base plus slugging, right there. So it's really integrated itself into the game and into the ethos of everybody, just about. And it was an evolution that started long ago, and only recently, I think, really has fully settled in. And there's probably even more. I would suspect there's even more room for progress, but it's pretty ubiquitous at this point. So that would be something that I would want people to be aware of, about the overall story of the A's and Moneyball. Where the A's deserve credit, and they deserve a lot of credit, is being the first team to go all in, which takes a lot of confidence, a lot of willingness to go out on a limb. Because even if you make all the right decisions, the results could be negative, right? And so the A's deserve a lot of credit for innovating, for sure, and accelerating the understanding. But to go all in and implement it and be successful was a huge accomplishment, and the catalyst for really accelerating the evolution in the game.
Okay, and that makes perfect sense with what you were saying earlier about how you need that bigger sample size. So somebody has to be the first to essentially dedicate an entire season, if this is going to work or not.
Yeah, that's a great point. Agreed.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to chat about Moneyball. I've had a ton of fun.
Absolutely, it's been great, and getting to reminisce about this has been a ton of fun for me as well. So thank you, Dan. I really appreciate you having me on.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Will Cooper once again for taking the time to help us separate fact from fiction in 2011's Moneyball. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our two truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a refresher, here are the two truths and one lie. Number 1, Jonah Hill's character in the movie was based on someone whose name was not Peter Brand. Number 2, Art Howe was not the angry person that we see in the movie. Number 3, it is true that the Oakland A's made their players pay for soda during the 2002 season. Did you find out which one is a lie? Let's start with number 1. Jonah Hill's character in the movie was based on someone whose name was not Peter Brand. That is true. The character of Peter Brand in the movie was based on Paul DePodesta, who, as of this recording, is working as the Chief Strategy Officer for the Cleveland Browns football team. That brings us to number 2. Art Howe was not the angry person that we see in the movie. That is also true. And by true, I mean Art Howe was not as angry as the movie seems to make him out to be. Although Will pointed out that he was not involved in a lot of the one-on-one conversations between Art Howe and Billy Beane. He also made the point that it was probably the biggest distortion in the movie of how it depicts Art Howe as portraying as an angry, surly person, when in Will's opinion, he was actually a friendly, positive, and very nice person. That means the lie is number 3. It is true that the Oakland A's made their players pay for soda during the 2002 season. As we learned, even though the A's budget was a lot smaller than other Major League Baseball teams, they still allowed all their players to drink as much pop, or soda, depending on what you call it, as they wanted. And that just about wraps up our time together today. Before we go, the last thing I like to do on each episode is to share how much time and effort went into creating this episode. My hope in sharing this information is to go beyond just my podcast, but hopefully you'll start to appreciate all the podcasts that you listen to for free just a little bit more. Of course, I only have these stats for my own show. So with that said, today's episode took a total of 39 hours to create. And as I always do, I want to make it clear that is only my time for this one episode. In other words, that 39 hours does not include any of my guest time with the subject matter that we talked about. It also doesn't include the time that it takes for me to do podcast-related things that are not a part of creating this one episode. For example, the time it takes to maintain the Based on a True Story website, social media, email newsletter, and so on. All those things take time to set up and maintain, and they cost money that goes beyond things associated with this one episode, but they're all things that are required because if I didn't do any of those things, then there wouldn't be any episodes of Based on a True Story at all. In a nutshell, this podcast may be free to listen to, but it is not free to create. And that's why I'm so thankful for the sponsors whose ads you've heard on this episode. You can find out more information about them over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/advertisers. But they're not the only ones helping to keep this show alive. There are wonderful people just like you who are helping to keep this show financially going. So if you found value in today's episode, and if you're using a Podcast 2.0 app, I'd really appreciate it if you boost now. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed today's episode enough to share it with a friend. Maybe even consider helping to support the next episode over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. Once again, that's basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.